I now call the honourable member for Aston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, there is a manufacturing business called Vicpol, which is in Bayswater on the edge of my electorate. It's a very successful business which has been manufacturing for over 20 years now, and it manufactures street poles and street bollards and other street furniture, which you'd be aware of. It employs about 40 people, many of whom have been working in the firm now for 12 to 15 years or more. But Alan Vickery, the managing director of Vicpol, says that after 20 years of operation, he may have to cease manufacturing due to the impact of the carbon tax and start importing instead, in the same way as all of his competitors do. He says, and I quote, "The proposed carbon tax would be very damaging for Vicpol. That's what concerns me, is that we've got 40 employees working for Vicpol who depend on the fact that we are competitive when we make our poles in Australia." He goes on to say, "I can't build in a measure to counter a 20% price increase when my competitors don't have that cost. It wouldn't be the end of Vicpol," he says, "but it would be the end of 40 jobs. There would be no requirements to have 40 employees to unload containers," he said, "if you simply imported the products from China." So in this instance, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have a small to medium-sized manufacturer who will be put in great jeopardy due to the Prime Minister's carbon tax. Jobs will be lost, potentially 40 jobs, 40 good workers who have been loyal to this firm for over 10 or 15 years, and emissions will probably go up as a result. And I raise this particular business, Mr Deputy Speaker, because to determine the impact of a carbon tax on business, you need to look at the individual enterprise level and the impacts that tax will have on that individual enterprise. It's all very well to have the grandiose models which suggest that X, Y or Z might be happening, but you have to look at the individual, either family or the enterprise level, to actually determine what will be the impact on that enterprise from the imposition of a carbon tax. And in this instance, Mr Deputy Speaker, the impact will be 40 jobs on the line. And I can tell you that Vicpol is not the only manufacturing business like this in Australia, or indeed even in my own electorate. There are small and medium-sized manufacturers who are indeed often operating at a globally best practice level, both in its operations and indeed in its emissions intensity at a global best practice level, who will be hit by this carbon tax and will be reduced in size and have to lay off workers as a result of it. None of these small and medium-sized enterprises will receive compensation. All will face increased costs. All will face competitive disadvantage against the imports which come in, which do not have the carbon tax on their products. And therefore, all will face pressure on jobs. And for what impact, Mr Deputy Speaker? Will Australian emissions go down as a result of that? Well, yes, in part. If a business goes out of business and stops manufacturing, yes, that business will produce fewer emissions. It will produce fewer emissions if businesses close down. The government's got that right. But when you actually look at a global level, which is what's important, frequently emissions will actually go up globally because our manufacturers in Australia often have a better emissions intensity than our competitors do, certainly in China. And of course you have to add to that the transportation costs and the emissions due to transportation on top of that also. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is the ridiculousness of the carbon tax, as even some on the Labor side now acknowledge. And that is, if you put a tax on our manufacturing in a context when there is no tax on competitor imports, then you will simply cost Australian jobs and have no impact on global emissions. Indeed, you may increase global emissions. This is the farce, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I invite the member for Latrobe and I invite the member for Deakin to come with me to the manufacturing belt in Bayswater, where they have some of it overlaps in their electorates, and to go with me to those manufacturers and for them to explain to those manufacturers the impact that the carbon tax will have on them and on their employees. And the member for Indi has kindly agreed to join us as well, so we can potentially have a team of 4 of us going, and I invite them to come with me even to visit VicPol as soon as possible. Of course, the implementation of the carbon tax would be bad enough if the situation for Australian manufacturers were not so dire in the first place. We've had close to 90,000 manufacturing jobs which have been lost in the last 3 years alone. That's 550 jobs lost each and every week, Mr Deputy Speaker. 1 in 12 workers in the manufacturing sector in Australia has lost their jobs in the last 3 years. Yet despite manufacturing being under significant pressure, in its declining, in jobs being lost, in suffering from the high Australian dollar, suffering from higher interest rates compared to overseas countries, the government seeks to make things worse. And of course it comes into this place and has the temerity to say that the carbon tax is actually all about jobs. Almost day in, day out, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have the temerity to come into this place and say that the carbon tax is actually all about creating jobs.
It's about imaginary jobs.
It's imaginary jobs in their imagination. In fact, the only jobs which they appear to be interested in, Mr Deputy Speaker, is their own. Mr Deputy Speaker, are so many manufacturing businesses wrong when they say that the carbon tax is going to hurt them? Are they simply not listening to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer when they say that this is actually about job creation, this tax? Well, I don't think so, Mr Deputy Speaker. I don't think that Kate Carnell from the Australian Food and Grocery Council is incorrect when she says that for Julia Gillard to say that food companies who aren't in the top 1,000 emitters won't be affected by a carbon tax is simply wrong. I don't think she's incorrect in saying that. I don't think Manufacturing Australia is incorrect when it says that it tolls the death knell for manufacturing in Australia. It represents the introduction of a multi-billion-dollar tax that will impact on every Australian financially, far in excess of the capacity of many businesses and everyday Australians to pay. I don't think they're wrong either in saying that. I actually don't think that Paul Howes is wrong when he says that carbon pricing could be the straw that breaks the camel's back as far as some industries are concerned. I don't think Paul Howes is wrong in that regard either, Mr Deputy Speaker. I could go on. I could obviously refer to the chairman of BlueScope Steel. He says, why is the government prepared to sacrifice a key sector of the Australian economy by introducing a carbon tax on Australian manufacturers with little impact on world CO2 generation? Mr Deputy Speaker, I would invite the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and the Climate Change Minister and their Industry Minister and indeed all members on the other side of this House to listen to the words of those industry leaders and listen to the words, indeed, of those union leaders who have been supporting them to date. These industry leaders and Paul Howes are not wrong, Mr Deputy Speaker. They know the impact of the carbon tax on their business. They know it will cost jobs. They know it will have very, very little impact, if any, on global emissions. And what they also know, Mr Deputy Speaker, like every Australian knows, that no matter what the carbon tax starts at, whether it be $15 or $20 or $25 a tonne, that will just be the beginning. And over time it will continue to go up, and it will continue to go up, and it will continue to go up, Mr Deputy Speaker. And let's not forget, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this carbon tax has no mandate. None of us will ever forget that, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was introduced on the basis of a lie. The Prime Minister, the day before the election last year, she went to the Australian public and she said there would be no carbon tax under a government she leads. And each of us in this House knows that had she been honest on that day, had she said that there would be a carbon tax under a government that she leads, that she would not be Prime Minister today, Mr Deputy Speaker. We all know that. It's been introduced on the basis of a lie. It has no mandate, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's going to affect our manufacturers right across Australia, including in my own electorate of Aston, and we call on the Prime Minister to call an election to get a mandate if she honestly believes this is the answer for the manufacturing sector.